Hey guys, welcome back to the Readers. I hope you are having an amazing day. Let's get right into the stories. The first one is an entitled People story. Why did a fire truck roll up to my house for a fire that wasn't even a problem? The call claimed it was a massive, out-of-control bonfire, except it was literally s'mores in a smokeless pit. So who lied, and what did they hope would happen next? My house sits on what I like to call a grandfather property. It was built back in 1984 by the original owners, way before any of this fancy subdivision nonsense existed around here. The land around me was mostly farmland and woods back then. Fast forward to about 10 years ago, developers bought up all that surrounding property and turned it into one of those upscale planned communities with matching mailboxes and strict rules about what color you can paint your shutters. You know the type. My property never got absorbed into any of that because it was already established, already had its own deed, and frankly, I had no interest in joining their little club. I like my independence. I pay my property taxes directly to the county, I handle my own landscaping, and I don't answer to anyone except the actual city codes and ordinances like every other homeowner should. So last September, I decided to treat myself. I had been working extra hours all summer and managed to save up enough to buy one of those really nice smokeless fire pits. You have probably seen them advertised online. They are cylindrical, stainless steel, and they burn wood so efficiently that there is barely any smoke at all. I had done my homework before buying it. I checked all the local fire codes. I made sure my setup was compliant with everything. The pit had to be at least 15 feet from any structure, which mine was. I kept a garden hose connected and ready nearby. I even bought a proper fire extinguisher and mounted it on my back porch just to be extra safe. I spent a weekend building a nice little stone seating area around the pit. Nothing fancy, just some flagstones I got from the hardware store and 4 Adirondack chairs I found on sale. It looked really good when I finished. The whole setup cost me about $2,000 total, but it was worth it. There is something peaceful about sitting outside on a cool autumn evening with a small fire going, just relaxing after a long week. The first few weeks of having the fire pit were perfect. I would come home from work, change into comfortable clothes, head out back, and enjoy the evening. Sometimes I would read a book, sometimes I would just sit there and think about nothing in particular. It was my little slice of peace. On one particular Friday night in late September, I had a couple of friends over. Nothing crazy, just 2 buddies from work who wanted to hang out. We roasted marshmallows, made some s'mores, drank a few beers, and talked about sports and work drama. The fire was small and well-contained like always. We were done by 10 at night, and I made sure the fire was completely out before everyone left. I dumped water on it, stirred the ashes, and checked twice to make sure nothing was still burning. That Tuesday when I got home from work, I found something weird stuck in my front door. It was folded paper, not in an envelope or anything, just wedged into the door frame. I pulled it out and unfolded it while I walked back to my car to grab my work bag. The paper had some kind of official-looking header at the top with a logo and the subdivision name. Below that was a formal notice saying I was being cited for unauthorized open flames and nuisance smoke. The fine was $250. There was a reference to some bylaw number and a date by which I needed to pay. I actually laughed out loud standing there in my driveway. This had to be a mistake. Obviously, someone at the HOA had screwed up their mailing list or something and sent this to me by accident. I mean, I am not even part of their HOA. Never have been, never will be. My property is completely separate. I crumpled up the paper and tossed it in my kitchen trash can. I figured that was the end of it. Someone would eventually realize their error and that would be that. I thought that was the end of it. I could not have been more wrong. 2 weeks went by and I kind of forgot about the whole thing. I used my fire pit a few more times during that period. The weather was getting colder and it was perfect fire pit season. Then one evening when I came home from work, there was another paper stuck in my door. This one was even more aggressive in tone. It said my previous fine had gone unpaid and late fees had been added. The total was now $500. It also mentioned that legal action would be taken if I did not pay immediately. There was a phone number and an email address at the bottom for the HOA president. Now I was annoyed. This was clearly not just a clerical error if they were sending a second notice. Someone was either incredibly incompetent or they genuinely thought I was part of their HOA. Either way, I needed to clear this up before it got even more ridiculous. I sat down at my computer and wrote an email to the address listed. I kept it polite but firm. I explained that my property was built in 1984, long before the subdivision existed, and that I had never been part of any HOA. I told them to check their property records and update their files accordingly. I asked them to cancel these fines and stop sending me notices. I hit send and figured that would be the end of it. A reasonable person would look into it, realize the mistake, and apologize. But apparently the HOA president was not a reasonable person. She replied within 20 minutes. I could not believe how fast the response came back. Her name was at the bottom of the email and she had a title listed as HOA president. Her response completely ignored everything I had just explained. She wrote that because my property shared a visual boundary with the subdivision, I was bound by their covenants through something she called implied consent. She said that my fire pit was visible from homes within the subdivision and therefore fell under their jurisdiction. I read the email 3 times trying to make sure I was understanding it correctly. This woman genuinely believed that because people in the subdivision could see my backyard, I had to follow their rules. That is not how property law works. That is not how any of this works. I wrote back explaining again that implied consent is not a real legal concept in this context and that property boundaries are clearly defined by county records. I told her I was happy to provide copies of my deed and the plat map if needed. Her response came back even faster this time. She was clearly sitting at her computer just waiting to argue with me. She said the board had discussed my property and they stood by their position. She demanded payment within 48 hours or they would proceed with legal action. She also mentioned that continued violations would result in additional fines. I was starting to get genuinely angry now. This woman was either completely delusional or she was on some kind of power trip, maybe both. I decided to ignore her for the time being and do some research on my own. I spent that evening looking up property records online through the county website. Sure enough, my property boundaries were crystal clear. The subdivision started at the property line next to mine. There was no overlap, no gray area, nothing. I downloaded and saved copies of everything I found. I also pulled out my original deed from the fireproof box where I keep important documents. The deed clearly showed my property as a standalone parcel with no mention of any HOA or covenants. I scanned it and saved a digital copy. For the next week, I did not hear anything from the HOA president, and I thought maybe she had finally done her homework and realized she was wrong. I kept using my fire pit as usual because, again, I was not doing anything illegal and I was not part of their HOA. Then things started getting weird. One night I was out back around 8 in the evening with my fire pit going. I was alone, just reading a book by the firelight. Suddenly a flashlight beam hit me right in the face. I looked up and saw someone standing at the edge of my property line with a high-powered flashlight, shining it directly at me and my fire pit. I stood up and called out asking who was there. The person did not respond, but I could see them writing something down on a clipboard. Then they walked away back into the subdivision. The whole encounter was maybe 30 seconds, but it left me feeling really unsettled. Over the next week, this happened 3 more times. Different nights, different people, but always the same routine. Someone would walk up to my property line, shine a light into my yard, write something down, and leave without saying anything. It was obviously some kind of HOA patrol or security, but I had no idea what they thought they were accomplishing. I started documenting everything. Every time someone showed up, I would note the date and time. I took photos of the people with their flashlights when I could, though it was hard to get clear pictures in the dark. Then came the fire department incident, and that is when things went from annoying to absolutely insane. It was a Friday night, and I had invited the same 2 friends over again. We were having another fire pit night, roasting marshmallows, and just enjoying ourselves. The fire was small like always, no smoke, completely under control. We had been out there for maybe an hour when suddenly we heard sirens. A full-size fire truck pulled up in front of my house with lights flashing. I immediately thought something must have happened to one of my neighbors. Maybe someone had a kitchen fire or something. But then 3 firefighters came walking around the side of my house into my backyard. The captain, you could tell by his helmet, looked at me, looked at my tiny fire pit, looked at the marshmallows and graham crackers on the table, and then he sighed really heavily. He asked if this was my fire. I said yes, and I asked what was going on. He explained that they had received a 911 call about a massive uncontrolled bonfire that was threatening nearby homes. He looked around my yard again and said it was pretty obvious that the call was nonsense. He could see that I had the fire pit set up correctly, the garden hose was right there, and everything was safe and legal. I told him about the HOA situation and he nodded like he understood immediately. He said they get false calls from HOA disputes more often than people would think. He walked around the fire pit, checked the distance from my house, and confirmed everything was up to code. Then he did something that turned out to be incredibly helpful. He radioed back to dispatch and asked them to flag the number that made the call as a potential nuisance caller. He told me I should file a police report about the harassment, and he said he would write up his incident report to reflect that this was a false emergency call. Before he left, I asked if I could get a copy of that report. He said absolutely, and he told me I could request it from the fire station the next day with the incident number he gave me. The whole fire department visit lasted maybe 15 minutes and then they left. My friends and I tried to get back to enjoying the evening, but honestly the mood was kind of ruined. We called it a night pretty soon after. I felt bad because this was supposed to be a fun, relaxing time, and instead we had fire trucks showing up. The next morning, I drove to the fire station and requested the incident report. The person at the desk was really helpful and printed it out for me right away. The report clearly stated that the call was unfounded, that the fire pit was legal and properly maintained, and it even noted that the captain suspected this was a false report made in bad faith. I thought that having this documentation might be useful, but I had no idea just how important it was about to become. On Monday, just 3 days after the fire department incident, I got home from work and found another paper in my door. This one was different. It was several pages long and it had all kinds of legal-sounding language. It was titled, Notice of Intent to File Lien. The document claimed that I now owed the HOA over $1,500 in fines and fees. It listed multiple violations, including the original fire pit citation, late payment fees, continued violations after being warned, and something called administrative processing fees. The notice said that if I did not pay within 10 days, they would file a lien against my property and potentially force a sale to recover the money owed. I sat down on my couch and just stared at this document for a long time. These people were actually threatening to take my house over a fire pit that I was legally allowed to have, on property they had no authority over. That was the moment I decided I was done playing nice. If they wanted to escalate this into a legal matter, I was going to give them exactly what they were asking for. But I was going to make sure I had every single piece of documentation and evidence lined up perfectly before I made my move. The next morning, I took a personal day off work. I drove to the county clerk's office and spent 3 hours there getting certified copies of everything I could think of. I got my property deed, the subdivision plat map, the original zoning documents from when my house was built, and the current zoning maps. I paid for the official certification on all of it, which meant these were legal documents that could be used in court if needed. I also went to the police station and filed a harassment report. I brought all my documentation about the repeated trespassing with flashlights and the false 911 call. The officer who took my report was sympathetic and said this sounded like a civil matter mostly, but he agreed that the false emergency call was worth documenting. He gave me a case number and said I could reference it if I needed to take legal action. I made copies of everything. I organized it all into a big 3-ring binder with tabs and labels. I had a section for property records, a section for fire safety documentation, a section for all the notices I had received from the HOA, and a section for evidence of harassment. I also started looking into what my legal options were. I did not want to spend money on a lawyer if I could avoid it, but I wanted to know what was possible. I learned that I could potentially sue the HOA for harassment, defamation, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. I could also file a complaint with the state if they were operating outside their legal authority. But before I did any of that, I wanted to try one more thing. I wanted to confront these people directly and give them a chance to back down before I brought in lawyers and courts. I did some research and found out that the HOA held monthly general meetings at a community center in the subdivision. These meetings were technically open to any resident of the subdivision, but there was nothing saying non-residents could not attend since it was held in a public building. The next meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday at 7 in the evening. I decided I was going to attend. That Thursday, I left work a little early so I would have time to go home, change into nice clothes, and gather my materials. I put on slacks and a button-down shirt. I wanted to look professional and put together. I grabbed my binder of documentation and made sure I had extra copies of the key documents. I drove to the community center and arrived about 10 minutes before the meeting was supposed to start. There were already a bunch of cars in the parking lot. I walked in and followed the signs to the meeting room. The room was set up with rows of chairs facing a long table at the front. Maybe 30 or 40 people were already seated, all chatting with each other. I recognized a few faces from the subdivision, though I did not know anyone's names. I took a seat in the back row and tried to look casual. At 7 exactly, the HOA president walked to the front of the room and called the meeting to order. She sat down at the center of the table with 4 other people I assumed were the other board members. She started going through typical meeting business. She talked about upcoming maintenance projects. She reminded everyone about some rule regarding holiday decorations. She discussed the budget for landscaping. It was all pretty boring routine stuff. Then she got to what she called the enforcement report. This was apparently where she talked about violations and fines that had been issued that month. She mentioned several minor things, like someone who had not mowed their lawn promptly and someone else who had the wrong color welcome mat. Then she said something that made my blood boil. She said that the board had been dealing with a particularly difficult situation involving an adjacent property owner who was refusing to comply with community standards. She said this person had been warned multiple times about open flames creating a safety hazard and a visual nuisance. She said the board had been forced to escalate the matter and had filed for a lien against the property. She said all of this with this satisfied smile on her face, like she was proud of herself for being so tough on rule breakers. Several people in the audience nodded along like they approved of her taking a hard line. I waited until she finished her report and moved on to the next agenda item. Then, during the open forum section where residents could bring up issues, I raised my hand. She looked annoyed that anyone was interrupting the smooth flow of her meeting, but she acknowledged me. She asked what my concern was. I stood up so everyone could see me. I introduced myself and gave my address. I saw her face change when she realized who I was. I said I wanted to address the situation she had just mentioned regarding the adjacent property because I was that property owner. The room got very quiet. Everyone turned to look at me. I walked up to the front of the room carrying my binder. I opened it to the first section and pulled out copies of my property deed and the plat map. I handed them to the person sitting closest to the board table and asked them to pass them up. While the documents were being passed forward, I started explaining my situation to the entire room. I said I had been receiving notices and fines from the HOA for using a fire pit on my own property. I said I had tried multiple times to explain to the president that my property was not part of the HOA and never had been. I said she had ignored the facts and escalated the situation instead. The president tried to interrupt me, but I kept talking. I said I had documentation proving that my house was built in 1984. Decades before the subdivision existed. I said my property had its own deed and was not subject to any HOA covenants. By now, the board members were looking at the copies of my deed and the plat map. I could see confusion on their faces. One of them asked the president if she had verified my property status before issuing fines. She stammered something about implied consent and visual boundaries. I pulled out the next set of documents from my binder. These were copies of all the notices I had received, including the lien threat. I explained the timeline of how the fines had escalated from $250 to over $1,500 for a fire pit that was completely legal under actual city fire codes. Then I pulled out the fire department incident report. This was my best piece of evidence and I had been saving it for maximum impact. I explained that the president had called 911 and reported a massive uncontrolled fire that was threatening homes. I said the fire department had responded with a full crew and found nothing but my small, legal, compliant fire pit. I read directly from the report where the fire captain had noted that the call appeared to be made in bad faith and that he had flagged the number as a potential nuisance caller. I explained that making false emergency calls was actually a crime and that I had filed a police report about the incident. The room erupted. People started talking over each other. Several residents turned to the president and demanded to know if this was true. Others were asking why HOA dues were being spent to harass non-members. One man stood up and said he was a retired real estate attorney. He asked to see my property documents. I handed them over gladly. He looked them over for a minute and then announced to the room that my property was clearly not part of the HOA and any attempt to enforce HOA rules against me was legally baseless. The president tried to defend herself, but she was losing control of the room. People were angry. They were angry that she had wasted their HOA dues on legal threats that had no merit. They were angry that she had potentially exposed them to a lawsuit. They were angry that she had called in a false emergency to the fire department. I let the chaos continue for a minute and then I held up my hand to get everyone's attention again. I said I had not come here to cause trouble for the residents. I said I understood they were not responsible for the president's actions. But I said I needed this situation resolved immediately, and I needed assurances it would never happen again. I said I wanted all fines canceled in writing. I wanted a formal written apology from the board. I wanted confirmation that my property would be removed from any HOA enforcement lists. And I said I wanted the president to resign from her position. I said if these things did not happen, I would be filing a civil lawsuit against the HOA for harassment, defamation, emotional distress, and abuse of process. I said I had already consulted with an attorney and had been advised that I had a very strong case. I said the damages I would seek would be significant and would likely require a special assessment on all the homeowners to cover. That last part got everyone's attention. Nobody wanted to pay extra money out of pocket because their president had gone on a power trip against someone who was not even in their HOA. One of the other board members, a woman who had been looking increasingly uncomfortable this whole time, stood up and said she wanted to call for an emergency vote. She said it was clear that serious mistakes had been made and the board needed to take immediate action to correct them. Another board member seconded the motion. The president tried to object, but she was overruled. They voted right there to accept all my terms. The vote was 4-1, with only the president voting against. Then the woman who had called for the first vote made another motion. She moved to remove the president from her position effective immediately due to misuse of authority and mismanagement of HOA funds. That vote was also 4-1. The president's face went bright red. She stood up, grabbed her papers, and stormed out of the room without another word. A few people actually clapped when she left. After she was gone, the remaining board members apologized to me repeatedly. They said they had not been fully informed about the situation and had trusted her to handle enforcement matters appropriately. They said they would have never approved fining a non-member if they had known the facts. They asked me what I needed from them specifically. I repeated my list of demands. They agreed to all of it on the spot. They said they would have everything in writing and delivered to me within a week. I thanked them for their time and left the meeting. As I walked out, several residents stopped me to apologize personally and to say they had no idea what was happening. One guy even invited me to join them for neighborhood barbecues since I lived right next door anyway. The following Tuesday, I received a large envelope in my mail. Inside was a letter signed by all 4 remaining board members. The letter formally apologized for the way I had been treated. It acknowledged that my property was not part of the HOA and that all fines had been canceled. It confirmed that my address had been removed from their enforcement database and that I would not receive any further notices. There was also a check enclosed for $300, which they said was reimbursement for any expenses I had incurred dealing with this situation. I had not asked for money, but I was not going to turn it down either. Over the next few weeks, I heard through various sources what happened with the former president. Apparently, after being voted out, she tried to rally support from other residents to get reinstated, but nobody wanted anything to do with her. People were furious that she had nearly gotten them sued. Her husband, who also lived in the subdivision obviously, was apparently mortified by the whole thing. Word got around about what she had done, and she became basically a pariah in her own neighborhood. I saw her one time about a month after the meeting. I was coming home from work and she was driving past my house. She saw me pulling into my driveway and she immediately looked straight ahead and sped up like she was trying to pretend she had not seen me. I could not help but smile. After all the grief she had put me through, after threatening my home and harassing me for weeks, she could not even make eye contact anymore. That evening I went out to my backyard and started a fire in my pit. The weather was getting cold and it felt good to sit by the warmth. I roasted some marshmallows and made myself a couple of s'mores. I sat there for a long time, just enjoying the peace and quiet. My property was still mine, my fire pit was still legal, and the person who tried to take both away from me was gone. Sometimes standing up for yourself works out better than you could have imagined. I still use my fire pit regularly. I have never had another problem with anyone from the subdivision. In fact, the new board president actually came over one evening and introduced himself properly. He apologized again for everything that happened and said if I ever had any issues to let him know directly. I appreciated the gesture, but honestly, I was just happy to go back to my quiet life. I had never wanted drama or conflict. I just wanted to enjoy my property in peace. Looking back on the whole situation, I think the former president made a fundamental mistake that a lot of people in positions of minor authority make. She assumed that her power extended further than it actually did. She got so used to people following her rules that she forgot those rules only applied to people who had actually agreed to follow them. When she encountered someone who was outside her jurisdiction, instead of accepting that fact, she doubled down and tried to force compliance anyway. She probably thought she could bully me into paying the fines just to make the problem go away. What she did not count on was someone who would actually do their homework, gather evidence, and call her bluff in front of everyone. The whole experience taught me some valuable lessons about standing up for yourself and not backing down when you know you are right. It also taught me the importance of documentation. If I had not saved every notice, every email, and gathered all those official records, I would not have had nearly as strong a position when I confronted the board. So now on cool autumn evenings, I sit by my fire pit and think about how close I came to letting someone else dictate what I could do on my own property. I think about how satisfying it was to watch her lose everything she thought she had power over, all because she could not accept a simple fact that was written in black and white on county property records. And I make sure my fire is always contained, always safe, and always completely legal. Not because some HOA president says so, but because that is just the responsible thing to do. The next one is a malicious compliance story. So with this story, we are back at the resort I worked at multiple times. I worked at this place several times, and I have to dip back into those times to explain how I got hired. When I was 15, I had originally got a job doing room service and got really good at navigating the facility. When I was 18 to 19, I started growing out my hair and would wear a headband literally 100% of the time and thought I was cool. I got a call one day from a friend and past coworker who was very tied into the resort. The dishwashing team walked out and they needed someone now. I lived 150 feet from this resort and they were giving me a guaranteed job without an interview and would pay cash until I got in the system. The catch? I had to do 3 full kitchen's dishes right now with almost zero training. I worked solidly by myself in 3 kitchens, from open to close for weeks until they hired help. I lived somewhat close to the lady in charge of the entire resort who loved that I was involved with the resort again. She and I have always had a great friendship as neighbors. I ended up leaving to get a better paying job, which didn't really help me out because even though it was more per hour, I was working less and had to drive and spend more on gas. I got another call from that friend. I got an instant job there, again. This time, almost entire setup staff for banquets, meetings, and wedding had walked. Again, same conditions as above. I had a butt-ton of work to do, but just in a different department. I had found out that the lady in charge actually suggested my friend specifically call me because I was a known reliable worker. It's at this point where this story really begins. I had long, thick hair. No more headband. I wore it in a tight ponytail that came to my mid-back. I will also mention that I am a guy. Knowing I was going to be a front-of-house employee with guest contact, I would shower before going to work and pull my hair into a tight single braid. Once in place, I would run gel in so the loose, shorter strands would stay in place. I looked professional. Because of my unusual hiring conditions, I rarely ever saw HR. After over a year of working in this department, training a whole new team and 2 customer service awards, HR approached me. I literally had a tray of covered food on my shoulder, about to walk into a wedding. She stopped me. I saw her glance at my hair and said, "We've had several complaints about you. You need to put your hair into compliance according to the handbook by the time you show up to work tomorrow, or consider this your termination notice." She said this to me while I was absolutely slammed with work during dinner service at a 300-plus person wedding reception. Several servers were watching and gave me the appropriate "what the duck, who would have complained?" comforting words to myself. I put my head down and really don't remember the rest of the night. The next day, I am in my kitchen with my future wife and my mother. We have the employee handbook out and are looking at it. I am due into work soon as we have to tear down the wedding from last night and reset up for a wedding reception tonight. It was determined that I needed the job more than I needed the hair, but I liked my long hair, the area of the handbook we were looking at. Male hair must be kept above collar length. Ponytails are not permitted. Well, okay, ask and you shall receive. I washed and dried my hair, went back into the kitchen where my mom had pulled out the large soup pot that fit over my head and was deep enough to stop just over my collar, and started cutting. I do not have a picture of this. But picture Edna Mode from The Incredibles, except her hair is super thick and frizzed out like the witch from the old cartoon Sword in the Stone. We all equally laughed and cried. I found it hilarious, but we all missed my hair. I go to work, in compliance, and present myself to HR. She is shocked to see me. I don't know if it was because she didn't think I'd be back, or that I literally looked like I just licked an electrical outlet. I quoted the handbook and said that we should be good now. She argued that I looked horrible. I pointed out that she shouldn't shame my looks and that I, again, was in handbook compliance and would be going to work. It was very memorable going back to work. Everyone had something to say. It had gotten around what HR had pulled, and then it had gotten around what I did. Through all the laughs that were had, we had work to do. We had to get all of last night's wedding cleaned up, the grand ballroom had to get vacuumed, the tables and chairs placed in new positions, tablecloths in new place settings. The whole shebang. To those who have worked in this industry, I know you can visualize the amount of work. The lady who ran the resort stopped by because she always does before a reception just to make sure our standards are up. She sees me in the back hall carrying a rack of water glasses into the ballroom and yells my name. I pass off the glasses and run over. She is staring at my hair and asks, "What happened to your beautiful hair?" I explain the saga to her and see her body language change. Her lips thinned out and excuses herself. When I'm next in the hallway, my direct boss is there and hands me a hairband. I'm to put high hair in a ponytail on boss's orders. I think that's the end of it. Then I hear the rumors. She was in HR's office for an hour. HR just got walked out of the building. I never confirmed exactly what happened, but I do know the HR office was empty the next day. A few weeks later, we had a new HR lady. I found out because I saw someone new in the back halls. She approached me, held out her hat, and said, "You must be OP." Why the new HR lady knew me by name and could pick me specifically out of a crowd should have worried me. But I was young and stupid. Hair was in HR compliance for about 2 hours over the several years I works at that resort. Anyway, thank you for watching.